Hi, this is Sarah Becktel, and welcome back to Week 4 of Strathmore's Colored Pencil with Mixed Media Workshop. In this lesson, we will be focusing on techniques for combining pen and ink with colored pencil and fluid acrylic. I'll frequently be talking about value today, and I want to briefly discuss a value scale so we're all on the same page. Value refers to how light or dark something is, and this is a typical value scale. Value scales are usually numbered 1 through 10, with 1 representing white and 10 representing black. As the numbers increase, the value gets darker. When I'm working, I generally consider values that are 1 to about 3.5 as my light values, 3.5 to 7 as my middle values, and 7 to 10 as my dark values. The first technique I'll be demonstrating works best on a middle valued paper, so I'll be working on Strathmore's toned mixed media paper in blue. This paper is also available in gray and tan, but all 3 colors are a middle value, so any of these would work great. Feel free to use whichever color you prefer. These techniques can also be done on Strathmore's 500 series mixed media board or 400 series mixed media paper. These white surfaces can be toned with fluid acrylic to a middle value that's similar to the toned mixed media paper, such as I did here with these mixed media boards. If you'll be using a white paper and need a review of how to tone your surfaces, please check back to the demonstration in Lesson 1. For this demo, I've drawn a bullfrog on white sketch paper and transferred it to my toned mixed media paper. If you need a refresher on how to transfer your drawing, you can check back to Lesson 2 in this workshop series. I keep my graphite drawing as light as possible because once I get into applying acrylic and colored pencil, any extra graphite still on the paper can get mixed into my mediums and muddy the color. I'm starting this piece with my preferred technical pen, a Sakura Pigma Micron pen in size 01. There are many brands of high-quality technical pens, and you can use whichever pen you prefer, but I would recommend using a pen that has pigmented and waterproof ink. Pigment-based ink is usually more permanent and fade-resistant than dye-based ink, which is important to me because I don't want my artwork to fade over time. And in this lesson, I'll be applying fluid acrylic over top of the pen, so I need a waterproof ink that won't run when wet media is applied. As I'm getting started, I usually trace along the edges of my shadow areas and then begin shading using the hatching techniques I described in Lesson 1. Hatching, contour hatching, and cross-hatching. If you need a refresher on what those methods are, you can always jump back to Lesson 1 for my full introduction to pen and ink. When I apply my parallel lines, they begin to suggest the value and shape of the bullfrog. Some artists prefer to use only one method of hatching when they work in pen and ink, such as only cross-hatching or only contour hatching. But I like to have the flexibility to use whichever I think will work best. I'm using both straight and contour hatching, and I like how slightly curving my lines helps to suggest the roundness and volume of the bullfrog's body. In areas that I want to be darker, I use cross-hatching because the more lines that are built up in an area, the darker that area will become. I'm mainly using the ink to define and develop the areas of my drawing that are darker in value. I'll be using colored pencil to develop my lighter values, so for now I'm leaving those spots empty. Most brands of pens have their own distinct method of numbering the nib size, so you may need to do a little research to figure out what size pen you want to use. My Sakura pen is size 01, which means the nib is 0.25 millimeters. So if you're looking for a similar sized point in a different brand, you may need to consult that company's website or product literature to find out what their specific method is for numbering their pens. This demonstration has been sped up because shading with pen and ink isn't a particularly fast method of working, especially when using a thinner pen like what I have. But I prefer a thinner pen nib because I like the delicacy of the lines it creates. It takes a little patience, but I'm just taking my time and building up layers of hatching to create contrast between the light and dark areas of Mr. Bullfrog. It also takes some time and practice to get a good rhythm to your hatching technique. So as I mentioned in Lesson 1, when first getting started with ink pens, it's helpful to do some practice drawings of simple objects like eggs or fruit. I'm using a few different photo references while drawing this guy. The main photo that I'm using for his body position was taken at the American Museum of Natural History. The museum has multiple bullfrog models in their amphibian room that are incredibly realistic, but are actually made from cast wax that was hand-painted to mimic the look of real bullfrogs. Those models are quite good, but unfortunately they don't have that wet, shiny look to their skin that living frogs have. So I'm also using a few additional photos of live bullfrogs that I snapped during a visit to Acadia National Park in Maine. So once again, my drawing isn't an exact replica of any single photo, it's a composite of multiple photo references. Once I feel like I have good definition in my drawing and well-developed shadow areas, I let the ink dry for a few minutes and then I'll add a layer of transparent acrylic on top. When my ink is dry, it's waterproof, but it does need a few minutes to completely dry before I can apply wet media on top. Here I have a few drops of my fluid acrylic squeezed out on my palette. Over the course of this workshop, I've demonstrated using both fluid acrylic and watercolor. So if you prefer watercolor, you can absolutely use that in place of fluid acrylic here. But I'm using acrylic in ultramarine blue, Van Dyke brown hue, and transparent yellow iron oxide to create a dark brown gray with just a little hint of green. I'm adding lots of water to keep my mixture thin and transparent, and I'm testing my color on scrap paper before applying it to my bullfrog. I want this layer to be transparent so that I can see my pen lines through the acrylic. I don't want to lose the details of the drawing, I just want to deepen and unify those shadow areas. The acrylic layer really helps to add dimension and make the bullfrog look like he has a volume. As you'll remember from previous lessons, acrylic becomes permanent when it's dry and cannot be reworked. So I apply the acrylic conservatively and I make sure to do any blending of my edges before the acrylic has set up. However, as long as the acrylic is thin and transparent, hard edges and small mistakes can easily be covered up with subsequent layers of acrylic or with colored pencil. I'm applying my acrylic relatively smoothly in the shadow areas and not worrying too much about the bumpy texture of my bullfrog's skin. When I use this technique, I generally leave the shadow areas a bit flatter, and then I'll add more detail and texture in the light areas with my colored pencil. So I'll still have plenty of opportunity to get the bumps and texture of his skin. After I've applied acrylic on top of my pen in all the shadow areas, I'm also applying thin acrylic to areas of my frog that are a middle range value. I didn't think these areas were dark enough to be shaded with my black pen, but I do want them darker than the value of my toned paper. So in these areas, I'll apply acrylic to make them slightly darker and to help suggest the form of the bullfrog. In these spots, I'll play with the value of my acrylic, making it lighter or darker and blending it out to achieve more subtle gradations in value. As I'm building up the mid-tone values, I'll also add more acrylic to some of my darkest shadow areas to further push those dark values. I could continue to add acrylic if I felt Mr. Bullfrog needed more contrast, but I'm happy with him at this point, so I'm going to let my drawing dry for about 10 minutes, and then I can go back in and begin shading with colored pencil. Colored pencil will not stick to wet paint or paper, so I make sure to let my drawing dry out before starting the colored pencil stage. I'm beginning with an olive green and shading the areas of my frog that are a middle value. I can go over top of the acrylic, which I'm doing in some areas, and I'm also shading in some areas that do not have an acrylic layer. This olive green is a mid-tone value. It's not too dark or too light, similar to the value of the paper. So this is a great color to blend between my light areas and my shadow areas. This paper is smoother than the mixed media board that I used in lessons 2 and 3, so the colored pencil lays down a bit more evenly with less of a textural look. I can get a smooth appearance with my colored pencil in just one application, rather than having to shade over an area 2 or 3 times. Next, I'm going to use a brighter green to begin suggesting the highlight areas. I'm not putting this color into any of my shadow areas that were shaded with pen and acrylic. I'm just using this green in areas that are lighter in value. Because my toned paper is a middle value, this lighter green provides some contrast and really pops when I put it down. This is one of the reasons I love working on toned paper. When the entire surface of my drawing is already a middle value, my light values become very important and eye-catching. This is also the reason I primarily use this paper for all of my life drawing and sketching. When I'm out in the world with my sketchbook and I want to get something down on the page fast, having a medium value toned paper allows me to get contrast very quickly. I can use the bare surface of the paper for my mid-tone values, and then I just need to quickly block in my dark and light values. If you've never worked on toned paper like this before, I'd highly recommend it. It's a lot of fun and it yields great results relatively quickly. I'll go back and forth between my olive green and light green a few times to add some texture to his skin and work on the gradations between my values. And after I'm happy with my greens, I add a cream color for my brightest highlights. This is what really pumps up the contrast of my bullfrog and makes his skin look a bit wet and shiny. I'm shading with a slight speckled pattern to suggest the bumps on his skin, and I'm adding details such as the light ring around his pupil and the highlight in his eye. I'm also using a few brown colors to add more detail to the bullfrog's eye, as well as some spots on his skin. Adding these highlights and details is always my favorite part because it's what really starts to pull the drawing together. And it's easy for me to get carried away and start adding highlights everywhere. However, I'm careful to not add any light green or cream in the areas of shadow because I want to maintain a clear boundary between the light areas and the shadow areas. This is what gives my bullfrog shape and form. If I started adding highlights in the shadows, it would flatten out the bullfrog and my drawing would lose its sense of volume. After I put in my highlights, I'm adding a shadow beneath my bullfrog. This establishes the ground and visually represents that he's sitting on a solid surface rather than just floating around in space. I'm using a cool gray colored pencil that's just a few values darker than my paper, and then I'm adding a layer of acrylic on top to deepen and unify the shadow. After that, I'm putting just a few final touches in with colored pencil and pen to finish up my bullfrog. As long as I keep my colored pencil layers relatively thin, I can repeatedly go back and forth between mediums until I'm happy with the drawing. If I wanted, I could build up thicker layers of colored pencil. However, once my colored pencil gets to a point where it creates a thick, waxy coating on the paper, I will no longer be able to layer acrylic or pen on top. The ink would not be able to stick to the surface, and the acrylic would not be able to absorb into the paper. So I usually save thicker application of colored pencil towards the end of the drawing, when I know I'm happy with my pen and acrylic and don't need to add any more. Out of my bright lights used for filming, you can see the detail of my finished bullfrog a bit better. The pen, acrylic, and colored pencil work quite well together, and the middle value of my toned mixed media paper creates the perfect backdrop to emphasize the contrast between my shadows and highlights. I also use pen and ink to outline my colored pencil work when I want a bit more contrast. Here I have a pig that was created with colored pencil and fluid acrylic, the same method I demonstrated in Lesson 2. My pig's fur and the toned color of my mixed media board are quite similar in color and value. I like this effect, but I feel as though the edges of my pig are getting slightly lost, especially in the lighter areas such as the top of her snout and the tip of her ear. I'm going to use my Derwent graphic pen in size 0.3 to essentially outline the edges of my pig and create a little bit more contrast. The ink in this pen is gray, so it's lighter in value and has a softer look than the black pen I used in my bullfrog drawing. If I was using this technique with a drawing and surface that were darker in value, I would probably use my black pen, but I feel as though the black would create too strong of a contrast on this specific drawing. I'm lightly going over the edges of my pig and using strokes that match the length of her hair. It's not a complete outline. I'm breaking up the lines and leaving little gaps so it doesn't seem too defined or harsh. The effect is subtle and the ink is almost indistinguishable from the colored pencil, but it adds just a little bit of definition to my drawing and it helps to separate my pig from the background. Even with a very sharp point, it would be extremely difficult to get lines this thin with colored pencil, so the ink pen just offers me a simpler option for achieving my desired effect. As you've seen throughout this workshop series, colored pencil is a versatile medium that works well in conjunction with other mediums such as acrylic, watercolor, and ink pen. Thanks so much for following along with me, and I hope you've learned lots of new techniques that can be applied to your own artwork.